Isabelle Jean-Baptiste's body was discovered by Fort Lauderdale police at 11:43 on the night of August 27, 2023, in the living room of the apartment she shared with her husband Jean-Luc Pierre, shot 7 times in what forensic investigators would later characterize as overkill, suggesting rage rather than calculated execution, with bullets striking her chest, abdomen, and face at close range, while she apparently attempted to flee toward the front door that was only meters away when the final shots ended, her desperate attempt to escape from the man she had married just 42 days earlier in a ceremony that had united 2 members of Fort Lauderdale's Haitian American community who had appeared to guests as perfect match between successful, established businessman and beautiful, ambitious young woman recently arrived from Port-au-Prince, seeking better life that America promised, but that would be tragically cut short by Jean-Luc's pathological jealousy and his violent response to discovering that Isabelle had been maintaining emotional and romantic connection with Marc Toussaint, a construction worker from her hometown, who represented the passionate, youthful love she had sacrificed when she accepted Jean-Luc's proposal, despite not feeling for him the same intensity she had experienced with Marc before. Immigration and practical considerations had forced her to choose stability over genuine affection. The investigation that would expose Jean-Luc Pierre as calculating murderer who had tracked Isabelle's phone, monitored her communications, and ultimately executed her when confronted with undeniable evidence of her affair, began with neighbor Elena Gomez's 911 call, reporting sounds of argument followed by gunshots, with responding officers finding Jean-Luc sitting calmly in his car outside the apartment building, holding the weapon and offering immediate confession that he had killed his wife after discovering her betrayal, showing no apparent remorse beyond his statement that she had forced him to take action through her disrespect and her violation of their marriage vows that he had believed were sacred commitments, rather than recognizing that Isabelle had been deeply conflicted about their relationship from the beginning, but had proceeded with marriage due to family pressure, immigration concerns, and Jean-Luc's promises of security and opportunity that seemed more important than the emotional fulfillment she had shared with Marc during their brief relationship in Haiti before practical circumstances had separated them and driven Isabelle toward what seemed like more sensible choice, despite the absence of genuine passion or deep emotional connection. The relationship between Isabelle Jean-Baptiste and Jean-Luc Pierre had begun 9 months earlier in November 2022 at the Haitian Evangelical Church of Fort Lauderdale, where both attended Sunday services, and where Jean-Luc had noticed Isabelle's beauty and her apparently devout participation in worship that suggested she possessed the traditional values he sought in a wife who would enhance his status in the community while providing the domestic partnership and eventually the children that would complete his image as successful, respectable member of the diaspora who had achieved the American dream while maintaining connection to Haitian cultural roots. The courtship that Jean-Luc orchestrated was proper and traditional on the surface, involving chaperone meetings, family introductions, and demonstrations of his financial stability through gifts and promises about the comfortable life he could provide, though beneath this respectability lay controlling tendencies and possessive jealousy that Isabelle initially interpreted as evidence of how much he cared, rather than recognizing as warning signs of dangerous personality that would eventually manifest in the violence that ended her life. The pressure that Isabelle experienced to accept Jean-Luc's proposal came from multiple sources, including her mother Marie in Port-au-Prince, who saw the marriage as opportunity to secure her daughter's future and to ensure continued financial support that Isabelle's nursing assistant salary provided, from church community that viewed Jean-Luc as ideal husband for young woman without local family support, and from Isabelle's own recognition that her immigration status and her financial struggles made refusing such an apparently advantageous match seem foolish, despite her lack of genuine romantic feelings for someone 11 years older, whose controlling behavior and emotional distance made her feel more like valued possession than cherished partner. The decision to marry Jean-Luc in July 2023 represented Isabelle's surrender of romantic ideals in favor of practical security, though her heart remained partially attached to Marc Toussaint, who had emigrated to Orlando several months earlier and who had begun reaching out through social media, expressing regret about their separation and desire to reconnect, despite knowing she was engaged to another man. The wedding ceremony that united Isabel and Jean-Luc on July 16th was celebrated by their church community as beautiful union between two faithful members, with Pastor Daniel Joseph officiating and speaking about the sacred covenant of marriage requiring absolute loyalty and mutual submission to God's will, words that Jean-Luc would later cite as justification for his belief that Isabel's affair represented not merely personal betrayal, but spiritual transgression, deserving severe punishment. The wedding night and the brief honeymoon period revealed to Isabel the full extent of Jean-Luc's controlling personality, with him immediately establishing rules about her behavior, her clothing, her friendships, and her communications with anyone he had not specifically approved, transforming from attentive suitor to domineering husband, whose expectations about wifely obedience reflected his belief that marriage gave him ownership over Isabel's time, her body, and her emotional life in ways that left no room for the independence she had been developing during her 2 years in America, working and living on her own before meeting him. The reconnection with Mark that would ultimately trigger Isabel's murder began innocently through Facebook messages, where Mark had reached out to congratulate her on her marriage, while also expressing his own loneliness and his regret that circumstances had prevented them from building the life together that they had discussed before poverty and immigration realities had forced them apart. The escalation from friendly contact to explicit romantic communication occurred gradually, as Isabel found herself sharing with Mark the frustrations and disappointments of her marriage to Jean-Luc, receiving in return the emotional validation and passionate expressions of desire that were completely absent from her relationship with a husband who viewed her primarily as status symbol and domestic servant rather than as partner, deserving respect and affection. The plans that Isabel and Mark made to meet in person during weekend, when Jean-Luc would be traveling to Haiti for business, represented Isabel's desperate attempt to reclaim some of the passion and joy that her practical marriage had sacrificed. Though she apparently failed to recognize or adequately assess the danger that discovery would pose, given Jean-Luc's possessive personality and his obsessive concern about his reputation in their community. The discovery of Isabel's affair occurred on August 26th, when Jean-Luc accessed her phone while she slept and found months of increasingly intimate messages between her and Mark, including explicit photographs and detailed planning for their upcoming rendezvous, evidence that shattered Jean-Luc's image of his perfect traditional wife and triggered the rage that would culminate in her murder the following evening. The confrontation that Jean-Luc initiated the morning of August 27th was witnessed by neighbors who heard shouting and sounds of violence, with Isabel apparently attempting to minimize the relationship while also asserting her right to emotional fulfillment that Jean-Luc's controlling behavior had denied her, responses that only intensified his fury by suggesting she felt entitled to betray him and by refusing to demonstrate the remorse and submission that he believed were appropriate responses to being caught in adultery, that he viewed as ultimate disrespect and humiliation. The tracking that Jean-Luc implemented on Isabel's phone following their morning confrontation revealed her communicate ions with Mark throughout the day, as she apparently contemplated leaving Jean-Luc and seeking refuge with friends or family who might help her escape the marriage that had become intolerable, and messages that Jean-Luc monitored in real time, while planning his response to what he had decided was betrayal so profound that it justified the violence he would commit that evening when Isabel returned home from her shift at the clinic, where she had been crying throughout the day, according to coworkers, who later testified about her emotional state and her fear about what Jean-Luc might do, despite her attempts to reassure them that she would be safe and that she had plans to leave him as soon as she could, arrange alternative housing, and ensure her mother would continue receiving the financial support that Jean-Luc had been supplementing beyond what Isabel alone could provide. The murder of Isabelle Jean-Baptiste occurred between 10:15 and 10:30 on the evening of August 27th, according to forensic timeline established through neighbor testimony, security camera footage from the apartment building, and analysis of Jean-Luc's phone location data showing he had been waiting in the parking lot for Isabel to return home from work. The confrontation that preceded the shooting was overheard by multiple neighbors, including Elena Gomez, who lived directly below the Pierre apartment and who described hearing Jean-Luc's voice shouting accusations about betrayal and disrespect, Isabel's voice pleading and crying, sounds of furniture being overturned and objects breaking, and finally, The 7 gunshots fired in rapid succession that ended Isabel's desperate attempt to escape from apartment and from husband, whose rage had overcome whatever restraint he had demonstrated during their morning confrontation, when he had apparently decided that her betrayal warranted death, despite his subsequent claims that he had not planned to kill her, but had simply brought his gun to apartment to frighten her into proper submission and respect. The forensic evidence documented at the crime scene revealed the brutal nature of Isabel's death, with her body positioned near the front door, suggesting she had been trying to flee when the fatal shots were fired, defensive wounds on her hands indicating she had attempted to shield herself from bullets, and the close-range pattern of gunshots, suggesting Jean-Luc had been standing over her when he fired the final rounds that struck her face and head after she had already been incapacitated by chest wounds that would have been fatal without the additional shots that demonstrated his rage rather than any practical necessity to ensure her death. The positioning of shell casings and blood spatter patterns told story of sustained attack rather than brief struggle, contradicting any potential claim that shooting had been accidental or that Jean-Luc had acted in self-defense against physical threat that Isabel's size and strength would have made implausible even if she had been armed, which she was not. The immediate surrender that Jean-Luc made to responding officers included his voluntary statement that he had killed his wife after discovering her affair, that she had deserved to die for betraying him and disrespecting their marriage, and that he would do it again if given the chance, because she had humiliated him before God and before their community in ways that no real man could tolerate without taking action to restore his honor and to punish the woman who had dared to make him look foolish. The lack of remorse that Jean-Luc displayed during initial questioning suggested personality disorder or cultural beliefs about masculine honor and appropriate punishment for female infidelity that made him view Isabel's murder as justified response rather than as crime-deserving punishment, though his subsequent legal strategy would attempt to generate sympathy through claims of temporary insanity or extreme emotional disturbance that might support reduced charges or manslaughter conviction rather than first-degree murder that prosecutors were determined to pursue, given the evidence of planning and the excessive brutality of the killing. The investigation into Jean-Luc's background revealed pattern of controlling behavior in previous relationships, with 2 ex-girlfriends providing statements about his possessive jealousy, his violent temper when challenged or disrespected, and his explicit threats about what he would do to any woman who betrayed him. Evidence that demonstrated Isabel's murder was consistent with his established personality, rather than representing aberrant behavior triggered solely by discovery of her affair. The testimony from church members who had known Jean-Luc for years revealed complex picture of someone who presented as generous and devout publicly, while displaying private controlling tendencies that some community members had noticed but had rationalized as cultural norms about male authority rather than recognizing as warning signs of dangerous personality that would eventually manifest in lethal violence when his control was challenged. The examination of Jean-Luc's phone revealed the tracking app he had installed on Isabel's device without her knowledge, giving him access to her location, her messages, and her calls in ways that violated her privacy while enabling his surveillance of her activities and his discovery of her affair with Mark. The digital forensics also documented Jean-Luc's online searches in the hours before the murder, including queries about justifiable homicide, crimes of passion, and whether infidelity constituted legal provocation for violence, suggesting premeditation or at minimum consideration of lethal response before actually committing murder, that he later claimed had been spontaneous reaction to confronting Isabel rather than planned execution of wife whose betrayal he had decided warranted death penalty he had no legal authority to impose. The testimony from Marie Jean-Baptiste, Isabel's mother in Port-au-Prince, provided devastating account of her daughter's dreams, her struggles, and her conflicted feelings about marrying Jean-Luc, despite her lingering love for Mark and her concerns about Jean-Luc's controlling personality that she had shared with her mother during their regular phone conversations. Marie's testimony included her guilt about encouraging Isabel to accept Jean-Luc's proposal for practical reasons, her recognition in retrospect of warning signs in Isabel's descriptions of Jean-Luc's behavior, and her determination to ensure her daughter's death resulted in justice rather than being dismissed as unfortunate result of marital conflict that some community members seemed inclined to blame partly on Isabel for conducting an affair rather than recognizing as deliberate murder by someone whose possessive jealousy had created conditions where any assertion of independence or emotional autonomy triggered violent response. The investigation into Mark Toussaint's role revealed someone who had been genuinely in love with Isabel and who had been completely unaware of the danger his relationship with her had created. With his communications showing concern for her well-being and his plans to help her leave Jean-Luc if she decided their marriage was untenable. The clearing of Mark as potential suspect or accomplice was straightforward, given his location data, placing him in Orlando throughout the evening of Isabel's murder and his cooperation with investigators who recognized him as a heartbroken survivor, rather than as participant in violence that had destroyed the woman he loved and the future they had been hoping to build together once Isabel could extract herself from marriage that had become intolerable. The testimony from Pastor Daniel Joseph about Jean-Luc's dark jealousy that he had observed during premarital counseling sessions provided crucial context about warning signs that had been present before marriage, but that had not been adequately addressed or reported to Isabel in ways that might have helped her recognize the danger and reconsider her decision to marry someone whose controlling tendencies and possessive attitudes toward relationships suggested potential for violence when his authority was challenged. The pastor's account of Jean-Luc's statements during counseling about his expectations that his wife would submit completely to his authority and about his beliefs that infidelity warranted severe punishment revealed someone whose traditional cultural beliefs about marriage and gender roles had been amplified into dangerous extremism that made violence against unfaithful wife seem not merely acceptable but morally required to restore honor and to punish transgression he viewed as unforgivable. The forensic psychology evaluation conducted as part of prosecution's case revealed that Jean-Luc exhibited narcissistic personality traits combined with pathological jealousy and rigid beliefs about masculine honor, requiring violent response to perceived disrespect, creating psychological profile of someone who was always potential danger to intimate partners, but whose violence had been triggered specifically by discovery of Isabel's affair that represented intolerable attack on his self-image and his status within community, where his reputation as successful, respectable man depended partly on his ability to control his wife and to prevent her from behaving in ways that might reflect poorly on his masculinity or his judgment in choosing her as partner. The formal charging of Jean-Luc Pierre with first-degree murder reflected prosecutors' determination that evidence clearly supported conviction for premeditated killing rather than heat of passion, manslaughter, with the tracking app, the incriminating online searches, and the overkill nature of the shooting, all demonstrating planning and consciousness of guilt incompatible with claims of temporary insanity or extreme emotional disturbance that defense would attempt to establish. The additional charges, including illegal surveillance and various firearms offenses, ensured that Jean-Luc would face substantial prison time even if prosecutors somehow failed to secure murder conviction, though the strength of evidence made such outcome highly unlikely, given the overwhelming forensic documentation and the eyewitness testimony establishing timeline and Jean-Luc's own confession immediately following shooting. The bail hearing attracted significant attention from both Haitian American community and from domestic violence advocates who viewed Isabel's case as representative of broader patterns of violence against immigrant women who married men from their cultural communities, expecting shared values and mutual support, but instead encountered controlling behavior and violence when they attempted to exercise autonomy or independence that their husbands viewed as unacceptable challenges to traditional authority structures. Judge Maria Santos denied bail after reviewing the brutal nature of the killing, Jean-Luc's explicit statements showing lack of remorse, and the flight risk posed by someone with business connections in Haiti who might attempt to escape jurisdiction before trial if released from custody. The defense strategy that emerged through pretrial motions focused on cultural factors and on extreme emotional disturbance, with Jean-Luc's attorneys arguing that his actions should be understood within context of Haitian cultural norms about marriage and infidelity that made discovery of wife's affair uniquely devastating for someone whose entire identity and community standing depended on his reputation as respectable family man who controlled his household appropriately. The defense attempts to introduce expert testimony about cultural differences in attitudes toward infidelity and masculine honor were partially successful, with judge allowing some evidence about cultural context, while rejecting broader arguments that might suggest different legal standards should apply to defendants from cultures where violence against unfaithful wives was more accepted or understood than in mainstream American society. The prosecution's case built methodically from documentation of Jean-Luc and Isabelle's courtship and marriage through evidence of his controlling behavior, his discovery of her affair, his planning and surveillance activities, and the brutal execution that had ended her life when she attempted to assert independence and emotional needs that his possessive personality could not tolerate. The timeline evidence was particularly damaging, showing that Jean-Luc had multiple opportunities to choose nonviolent responses, including divorce, separation, or counseling, rather than immediately resorting to lethal violence that served no purpose beyond satisfying his rage and his perceived need to punish Isabelle for daring to seek emotional fulfillment outside marriage that had failed to provide the love and respect she deserved as autonomous human being, rather than as property owned by husband, who viewed her primarily as reflection of his status and masculinity. The testimony from Isabelle's co-workers at the clinic where she had worked as nursing assistant provided emotional context about her personality, her dreams, her struggles adjusting to marriage with Jean-Luc, and her fear during final day of her life, when she had confided to several colleagues that she was planning to leave Jean-Luc despite concerns about his potential reaction and about financial implications for her mother's support. The co-workers' accounts of Isabelle's kindness, her dedication to her patients, and her obvious unhappiness in her marriage helped humanize victim for jury, while also establishing that she had been contemplating escape from relationship that had become intolerable, contradicting defense suggestions that her affair represented casual betrayal rather than desperate attempt to find emotional connection and validation that her marriage completely failed to provide. The forensic evidence presentation included graphic crime scene photographs, autopsy findings documenting the brutal nature of Isabelle's death, ballistic evidence establishing the sequence and positioning of shots, and digital forensics revealing Jean-Luc's surveillance activities and his incriminating online searches. The medical examiner's testimony emphasized the overkill nature of the shooting, explaining that Isabelle would have died from any of several wounds, but that Jean-Luc had continued firing even after she was incapacitated, demonstrating rage and intent to ensure death rather than any defensive purpose or accident that might have supported lesser charges. The testimony from Elena Gomez about hearing the argument and the gunshots provided crucial timeline evidence and documented the escalation from verbal confrontation to lethal violence, with her account of Isabelle's screams and pleas for mercy, contradicting any suggestion that shooting had been spontaneous or that Isabelle had been physically threatening Jean-Luc in ways that might justify self-defense claims. Elena's testimony also included her regret about not intervening earlier when she had heard previous arguments between Jean-Luc and Isabelle, reflecting broader social failures in recognizing and responding to domestic violence that often escalated to homicide, while neighbors and community members observed warning signs, but felt unable or unwilling to intervene in what they viewed as private marital matters. The expert testimony about domestic violence patterns provided framework for understanding how Jean-Luc's controlling behavior had created conditions for lethal violence when Isabelle attempted to exercise independence through her affair with Mark, with forensic psychologist explaining how possessive jealous partners often escalated restrictions and violence when victims tried to leave or establish emotional connections outside the relationship. The expert emphasized that Isabelle's affair did not cause her death, but rather provided trigger for violence that Jean-Luc's personality and his beliefs about masculine honor and wifely obedience made likely whenever his control was challenged in ways that threatened his self-image or his community reputation. The testimony from Pastor Joseph about his observations during premarital counseling revealed warning signs that should have prompted intervention, but that had been overlooked or minimized due to cultural assumptions about appropriate male authority in marriages, and due to pastor's own reluctance to discourage marriage between two church members who seemed compatible, despite Jean-Luc's concerning statements about his expectations for absolute wifely submission and his views about appropriate punishment for infidelity that went beyond normal expressions of preference for faithful partners into territory suggesting dangerous rigidity about gender roles and relationship control. The closing arguments synthesized weeks of testimony into competing narratives about whether Jean-Luc was a calculating murderer who had killed his wife to punish her betrayal and to prevent her from leaving him, or whether he was a traumatized husband who had snapped under psychological pressure of discovering her infidelity. Prosecutor Rebecca Morrison emphasized the planning evident in Jean-Luc's surveillance activities, his online searches, his decision to bring loaded gun to confrontation, and his brutal execution of Isabel when she attempted to flee, arguing that every element of his behavior demonstrated consciousness of guilt and deliberate choice, rather than temporary loss of control that might justify reduced charges or sympathy for someone who had systematically abused, ultimately murdered wife, whose only crime was seeking emotional fulfillment that her oppressive marriage had denied her. The verdict in Jean-Luc Pierre's trial was delivered on February 8, 2024, with jury finding him guilty of first-degree murder, along with convictions on surveillance and firearms charges, representing complete rejection of defense arguments about cultural context or emotional disturbance, justifying reduced culpability. The conviction reflected jury's determination that, regardless of Jean-Luc's cultural background or his emotional state, he had made deliberate choice to kill Isabel, rather than pursuing any of the many non-violent alternatives available to him, including divorce, separation, or accepting that his marriage had failed through no fault more serious than his own controlling behavior that had driven Isabel to seek connection elsewhere. The sentencing phase included devastating victim impact statements from Isabel's family and friends, describing the vibrant, talented young woman whose life had been destroyed by someone who claimed to love her, but who actually viewed her as possession to be controlled and ultimately eliminated when she dared to assert autonomy and emotional needs beyond his narrow conception of appropriate wifely behavior. Marie Jean-Baptiste's testimony was particularly emotional as she described her daughter's dreams, her struggles to build better life in America, and her sacrifice of genuine love for practical security that had ultimately led to her death at hands of husband who had presented himself as protector but who had actually been her greatest threat. The sentence of life imprisonment, without possibility of parole, reflected the brutal, premeditated nature of Isabel's murder and the complete absence of genuine remorse from Jean-Luc, who continued claiming throughout trial that his actions had been justified by Isabel's betrayal and that society's condemnation of his violence represented failure to understand cultural imperatives about masculine honor, requiring punishment of unfaithful wives. Judge Santos's statement accompanying sentence emphasized that no cultural tradition or religious belief could justify murder, and that Jean-Luc's attempt to weaponize culture to excuse his violence represented insult to law-abiding members of Haitian community who managed their relationship challenges without resorting to homicide. The broader impact of Isabel's case extended beyond individual prosecution to inspire enhanced domestic violence resources, specifically targeting immigrant communities where cultural factors and language barriers often prevented victims from accessing help or recognizing that controlling behavior and threats represented danger, requiring intervention before escalation to lethal violence. The reforms included culturally specific education about warning signs, multilingual hotlines staffed by counselors familiar with challenges facing immigrant women, and improved coordination between law enforcement and community organizations that could provide support while respecting cultural sensitivities that made some victims reluctant to engage with authorities they feared might not understand their situations or might blame them for relationship problems. The advocacy work that emerged from Isabel's murder included specific programs addressing how traditional cultural values about marriage and gender roles could be maintained while rejecting violence and control that some men attempted to justify through selective interpretation of cultural norms that actually represented patriarchal distortions rather than authentic cultural traditions. The educational initiatives emphasized that genuine respect for cultural heritage required rejecting violence while embracing values of mutual respect and partnership that were equally present in Haitian cultural traditions, though sometimes obscured by men who weaponized culture to justify their abusive behavior. The support that Marie Jean-Baptiste received from victim advocacy organizations helped her navigate the American legal system and eventually arrange for Isabel's body to be returned to Haiti for burial, according to family traditions, creating some small measure of closure though nothing could truly compensate for the loss of her daughter or restore the future that had been stolen through Jean-Luc's violence. The scholarship established in Isabelle's name supported other young Haitian women pursuing nursing careers, honoring her dreams and her dedication while creating positive legacy from tragic death. The relationship between Marc Toussaint and Isabelle's memory remained complicated by guilt about their affair having triggered Jean-Luc's violence, though victim advocates and prosecutors emphasized repeatedly that Jean-Luc bore sole responsibility for choosing murder rather than any of the many non-violent responses available to him. Marc's testimony during trial about his genuine love for Isabelle and his plans to help her escape her oppressive marriage provided counterpoint to defense suggestions that she had been casual betrayer rather than desperate woman, seeking emotional connection that her marriage had denied her. The ongoing impact of Isabelle's case within Fort Lauderdale's Haitian American community included difficult conversations about domestic violence, masculine honor, and the balance between cultural tradition and women's safety and autonomy. The willingness of some community leaders to publicly condemn Jean-Luc's actions and to reject any cultural justification for his violence represented an important step toward addressing domestic violence patterns that had been sometimes overlooked or minimized through cultural relativism that prioritized community solidarity over victims' safety and rights. The lasting legacy of Isabelle Jean-Baptiste's story serves as a reminder that immigrant women deserve protection from domestic violence regardless of cultural backgrounds or traditional values, that controlling behavior and possessive jealousy represent warning signs requiring intervention before escalation to lethal violence, and that no betrayal or infidelity justifies murder, regardless of cultural norms about masculine honor or appropriate punishment for unfaithful partners. Her case stands as testimony to the devastating consequences when traditional patriarchal beliefs about male authority and female submission are weaponized by dangerous men who view their partners as property rather than as autonomous individuals deserving respect, safety, and the freedom to seek happiness, even when that means leaving relationships that have failed to provide the love and partnership that healthy marriages should offer to both partners equally.